The old courthouse stood tall and proud in the heart of downtown, its stone steps worn from years of footsteps seeking justice. On this particular Tuesday morning, the building was busy as usual, filled with lawyers in expensive suits rushing around with their briefcases and stacks of papers. Dorothy Williams took each step slowly, one hand gripping her wooden cane, the other clutching her worn leather bag. At 78 years old, her body might have slowed down, but her mind remained sharp as ever. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days. People barely noticed her as they hurried past. Today wasn't just any day for Dorothy. Her grandson's friend Andra had been wrongfully accused of breaking into a local business. Dorothy knew the boy well. He had spent countless evenings at her kitchen table studying, while her grandson fixed cars in the garage. Andra was no thief, and Dorothy couldn't stand by and watch as the system swallowed up another innocent young man. Courtroom 302 was already half full when Dorothy arrived. She found a seat in the back row and carefully placed her bag beside her. From its depths, she pulled out a small notebook and pen, items she hadn't used in quite some time. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Richard Harmon swept in, his black robe flowing behind him like an ominous cloud. Judge Harmon was known throughout the county for two things: his quick decisions and his even quicker temper. He'd been on the bench for 15 years, and viewed most cases as interruptions to his golf schedule. Today seemed no different as he called the first case with barely concealed boredom. Dorothy watched carefully as different cases moved through the system. Some defendants had fancy lawyers who spoke with big words and confident smiles. Others had tired-looking public defenders whose eyes darted between messy case files and the clock on the wall. When Andrew's case was called, Dorothy sat up straighter. The boy looked so young and scared standing next to his public defender, a man who couldn't hide his exhaustion. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman with perfectly styled hair, spoke confidently about evidence and prior incidents that Dorothy knew were being twisted out of context. As the proceedings continued, Dorothy noticed several legal mistakes happening right before her eyes. The public defender wasn't objecting to hearsay. The judge was allowing evidence without proper foundation. This wasn't justice, it was a conveyor belt, and Andrew was being packaged up for prison. Before she could stop herself, Dorothy raised her hand. The courtroom fell quiet as Judge Harmon peered over his reading glasses at the elderly woman in the back row. "Excuse me," Dorothy said, her voice stronger than her appearance would suggest. "I believe there's an issue with the chain of custody for the evidence being presented." The silence deepened. Judge Harmon's face darkened with annoyed surprise. "Ma'am," he said, drawing out the word like it was something distasteful, "this is a courtroom, not a classroom. We don't raise hands here." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the gallery. Dorothy remained calm. "I understand, Your Honor. I'm simply pointing out that—" "What I understand," Judge Harmon interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension, "is that you should leave the legal matters to professionals. Unless you've got a law degree hidden in that bag of yours." More laughter followed, louder this time. The public defender looked down at his shoes. The prosecutor smirked. Andrew's shoulders slumped further. Dorothy's face betrayed nothing as she nodded once and returned to her notebook. But anyone looking closely might have noticed how her pen moved across the page with the precision of someone who knew exactly what to write and why it mattered. As the hearing concluded with Andrew being held over for trial, Dorothy quietly gathered her things. Judge Harmon had already moved on to the next case, having forgotten the elderly woman he'd mocked. He had no idea that in his courtroom sat a woman who had once argued before the Supreme Court, who had helped shape civil rights law, and who had taught constitutional law to some of the finest attorneys in the country. Dorothy walked slowly down the aisle and out of the courtroom. She had decisions to make and preparations to begin. After 20 years of retirement, it seemed she had one more case to take on. And Judge Richard Harmon had no idea what was coming his way. Dorothy couldn't sleep that night. The ceiling fan in her small apartment spun lazily above her bed, but her mind was racing faster than it had in years. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Andrew's defeated face in that courtroom. She saw Judge Harmon's smug smile. She heard the laughter that followed his mockery. By 5 a.m., she was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking through the notes she'd taken. The case against Andrew was weak, built on circumstantial evidence and a shaky witness statement. The security camera footage they claimed showed him near the store had been taken from such a distance that it could have been almost anyone of similar height and build. This wouldn't stand up to proper questioning, she muttered to herself, circling a particularly troubling point in her notes. The sun was barely up when Dorothy made her way to the spare bedroom. She hadn't opened this door in nearly 2 years, not since her grandson had moved out to start his own life. Now the room served as storage for memories she'd packed away, both physical and emotional. In the back of the closet, behind boxes of old Christmas decorations and photo albums, sat 3 large cardboard boxes labeled Simply Work. Dorothy pulled them out one by one, clouds of dust dancing in the morning light as she opened the first box. Inside were leather-bound law books, their pages yellowed but their contents still relevant. Constitutional law, criminal procedure, evidence. Dorothy ran her fingers over the embossed titles, remembering late nights spent studying these same books decades ago when she was one of only 3 black women in her law school class. The second box contained case files and legal briefs from her career, a career that had taken her from the trenches of civil rights battles in the South to the polished marble halls of the Supreme Court. Dorothy had argued 5 cases there before retiring to care for her ailing husband. She'd won 4 of them. In the third box, beneath a stack of certificates and awards she'd never displayed, Dorothy found what she was looking for: her bar card. It had expired, of course, but reactivating it would be a simple matter. Next to it lay her academic robes from Howard University, where she'd served as dean of the law school for 7 years. Dorothy Williams hadn't just been a lawyer. She'd been a force of nature in legal circles, her name spoken with respect in courtrooms across the country. Until personal tragedy and age had convinced her to step away. Can I still do this? She wondered aloud, staring at her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. Her hands weren't as steady as they once were. Her voice didn't carry the same commanding presence. But her mind was still as sharp as the day she'd graduated at the top of her class. By noon, Dorothy had made 3 phone calls. The first was to the State Bar Association to begin the process of reactivating her license. The second was to an old colleague who now taught at the local law school, someone who could provide her with updated case law. The third was to Andrew's public defender. That call had been the most difficult. The young lawyer, he couldn't have been more than 30, had been defensive at first, then dismissive. "With all due respect, ma'am," he'd said, talking to her as if she were a confused old woman, "I appreciate your concern for your grandson's friend, but I have the situation under control." "Do you?" Dorothy had asked quietly. "Because I counted 7 procedural errors in yesterday's hearing alone. The prosecution is building a case on evidence that should be inadmissible, and you didn't object once." The silence on the other end of the line had been telling. "Look," she continued, her voice softening, "I know you're overworked. The public defender's office always is. I'm just offering to help." "I don't even know who you are," he finally responded. Dorothy took a deep breath. "My name is Professor Dorothy Williams. I taught constitutional law and criminal procedure for 20 years. Before that, I argued before the Supreme Court. And tomorrow, I'm coming back to your office to discuss Andrew's case properly." She'd hung up before he could respond, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. After 20 years of quiet retirement, Dorothy Williams was stepping back into the arena. Not for glory or recognition, but because a young man's future hung in the balance. And because sometimes justice needed more than just the system to prevail. Sometimes it needed someone willing to fight for it. The courthouse seemed different to Dorothy the next morning. She wasn't just an observer anymore, she was a warrior returning to battle. She had spent the night reviewing case law and preparing her strategy. Her fingers ached from typing notes and her eyes burned from reading fine print, but a sense of purpose filled her that she hadn't felt in decades. Today, she wore her navy blue suit. It hung a bit looser than it had 20 years ago, but the quality of the tailoring was still evident. A simple pearl necklace, a gift from her late husband on their 30th anniversary, completed her transformation from invisible elderly woman to professional. As Dorothy climbed the courthouse steps, she noticed a few curious glances. She ignored them, focusing instead on keeping her breathing steady. Her reactivated bar card felt heavy in her pocket. Andrew's public defender, Thomas Lee, was waiting outside courtroom 302, his face a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Their phone conversation had clearly left him unsure what to expect. "Mrs. Williams?" he asked as she approached. "Professor Williams," she corrected gently, extending her hand. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Lee." He shook her hand, eyes darting to the leather briefcase she carried. "I looked you up last night," he admitted. "I found some old law review articles you wrote. They were impressive." Dorothy smiled. "That was a long time ago. Shall we discuss the case before we go in?" For the next 15 minutes, Dorothy laid out the problems with the prosecution's case against Andra. She spoke quietly but with unmistakable authority, citing relevant precedents without needing to consult notes. Thomas's expression gradually shifted from doubt to respect. "Why are you doing this?" he finally asked. "Why come out of retirement for a case that isn't even your family?" Dorothy's gaze was steady. "Because every case matters, Mr. Lee, every single one. And this young man deserves a proper defense." Inside the courtroom, Dorothy and Thomas sat at the defense table together. Andra looked confused when he was brought in, his eyes widening at the sight of the elderly woman he recognized from the back row now sitting beside his lawyer. "Who's that?" he whispered to Thomas. "Back up," Thomas replied with the first smile Andra had seen from him. When Judge Harmon entered, his eyes swept the room with the same bored expression as before, until they landed on Dorothy at the defense table. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by annoyance. "I see we have new counsel," he remarked dryly. "Would you care to introduce yourself for the record?" Dorothy rose slowly, her posture perfect despite her years. "Thank you, Your Honor. Dorothy Eleanor Williams, appearing as co-counsel for the defendant. I filed my paperwork with the clerk this morning." Judge Harmon peered at her over his reading glasses. "Mrs. Williams, are you sure you're in the right courtroom? Family court is down the hall." A few chuckles rippled through the gallery. Dorothy didn't flinch. "It's Professor Williams, Your Honor. And yes, I'm quite certain I'm where I need to be." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "For the court's reference, I've prepared a brief outlining several issues with the prosecution's evidence that require immediate attention." The judge's smile faded slightly. "Are you actually claiming to be an attorney, Mrs. Professor?" Dorothy corrected again, her voice remaining respectful but firm. "And yes, I am an attorney, licensed in this state since 1973. Former Dean of Howard University School of Law. I've argued before the Supreme Court 5 times, most recently in the case of Henderson v. United States, which I believe Your Honor is familiar with, as you've cited it in several of your own rulings." The courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor, who had been smirking, suddenly straightened in her chair. Judge Harmon's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, and finally, the dawning realization that he might have made a terrible mistake. "I've City," he managed finally, "and you're joining Mr. Lee as co-counsel." "That's correct, Your Honor." Dorothy handed copies of her brief to the court clerk, who passed them to the judge and prosecutor. "And if it pleases the court, we would like to address several issues before proceeding further." Judge Harmon stared at the document in his hands, then back at Dorothy. The woman he had dismissed and mocked just yesterday was now standing before him as a legal authority whose credentials outshone even his own. His face flushed slightly as he nodded. "Very well, Professor Williams. The court recognizes you as co-counsel." He cleared his throat. "You may proceed." Dorothy thanked him with a small nod and began to speak. Her voice filled the courtroom, clear, precise, and powerful. As she methodically laid out the flaws in the case against Andra, citing statutes and precedents with ease, the whispers started. Word spread quickly through the courthouse. By the time the morning session ended, the gallery had filled with curious observers. Court staff found excuses to enter the room. Even other attorneys slipped in during their breaks. They'd all came to see the same thing: the elderly woman in the simple pearl necklace who had suddenly transformed from a courtroom observer into a legal lioness. And behind the bench, Judge Richard Harmon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing too late that he had made the classic mistake of judging a book by its cover. By the time court reconvened after lunch, the energy in the room had completely changed. What had started as a routine case was now the talk of the courthouse. Extra chairs were brought in to accommodate the growing crowd of spectators. Dorothy sat calmly at the defense table, reviewing her notes. Beside her, Thomas looked both nervous and excited, like a student about to witness something remarkable. Andra kept glancing at Dorothy with a mixture of confusion and hope. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Harmon entered. The judge's usual confident stride seemed slightly hesitant. He nodded curtly toward Dorothy before taking his seat. "The court calls Detective Wilson to the stand," announced the prosecutor, a woman named Patricia Grant who had won nearly all her cases this year. She had the reputation of being ruthless, but now she looked wary, stealing glances at Dorothy as she set up her notes. Detective Wilson took the stand, a bulky man with 20 years on the force. He testified about the break-in at Taylor's Electronics, describing how security footage showed a young man matching Andrew's description near the store just before the alarm went off. "Detective," Patricia asked, "how certain are you that the person in the footage is the defendant?" "The build, height, and clothing match his description," the detective replied confidently. "The timestamp on the footage is 11:42 p.m., and the alarm was triggered at 11:51 p.m. When it was time for cross-examination, Thomas turned to Dorothy. She gave him an encouraging nod, and they had a whispered conversation. Then Thomas stood, his posture straighter than before. "Detective Wilson," he began, using a line of questioning Dorothy had suggested, "was the person's face visible in this footage?" The detective shifted in his seat, not clearly. "The camera is positioned at the corner of the building." "So you can't positively identify my client from this footage, can you?" "The clothing and build." "Just a yes or no, please," Thomas pressed, his confidence growing. "Can you positively identify Andra from this footage?" "No," the detective admitted. Thomas looked at his notes, then continued with Dorothy's carefully crafted questions. By the time he finished, the detective had admitted that several elements of the case were based on assumptions rather than evidence. Judge Harmon watched with grudging respect. He could see Dorothy's legal-minded work, even though Thomas was asking the questions. When the prosecution called their next witness, the store owner who claimed he saw someone running from the scene, Dorothy stood up. "Your Honor, I'll handle this cross-examination," she said quietly. Judge Harmon nodded, sitting up straighter as if preparing himself. The store owner, Mr. Taylor, testified that he'd arrived at his shop after the alarm went off and saw someone running down the alley beside his store. "And you're certain it was the defendant you saw?" Patricia asked. "Yes, I recognize him," Mr. Taylor insisted. "He's been in my shop before." Dorothy approached slowly, her cane tapping gently on the floor. The sound somehow made the courtroom even quieter. "Good afternoon, Mr. Taylor," she said pleasantly. "I just have a few questions for you." Her voice was kind, almost grandmotherly, but there was steel beneath it. "You testified that you saw someone running down the alley at approximately midnight, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And the lighting in this alley, how would you describe it?" Mr. Taylor hesitated. "Well, it's not great. There's one streetlight at the end." "I see. And how far away were you when you saw this person?" "About 50 feet, I guess." Dorothy nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Taylor, I have here the police report you filed that night." She held up a document. "May I approach, Your Honor?" Judge Harmon nodded, watching her carefully. Dorothy handed the report to Mr. Taylor. "Could you please read what you told the responding officer about identifying the person you saw?" The store owner looked uncomfortable. "It says I told the officer I couldn't clearly see who it was because it was dark." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "Yet today, 3 months later, you're certain it was my client?" Dorothy asked gently. "Well, Did something happen to improve your memory between then and now, Mr. Taylor?" The store owner looked at the prosecutor, who couldn't hide her discomfort. "Detective Wilson showed me some pictures," he finally admitted. "He said they had their guy, and I should take another look." Dorothy's expression didn't change, but her eyes flickered toward Judge Harmon. "No further questions, Your Honor." As she returned to her seat, Dorothy noticed the judge watching her with an unreadable expression. She had just exposed a serious issue with the prosecution's case, witnesses being coached, and done it so skillfully that Mr. Taylor had practically volunteered the information. During the afternoon break, Court staff and other lawyers approached Dorothy in the hallway. Some remembered her from cases years ago. Others had heard of her but never met her in person. A few young law clerks asked for advice. Thomas watched with growing amazement. "You're like a legal celebrity," he whispered. "Why did you ever leave all this behind?" Dorothy smiled sadly. "Life gives you different seasons, young man. I had my time in the spotlight. Then I needed to care for my husband when he got sick. After he passed, I just stayed away." "Well, I'm glad you came back," Thomas said. "The way you handled that cross-examination, I've never seen anything like it." Dorothy patted his hand. "The case isn't over yet, and Judge Harmon isn't going to make this easy for us." She was right. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Harmon seemed determined to reassert control. He sustained several of the prosecutor's objections on questionable grounds and overruled Dorothy's valid ones. But with each ruling, Dorothy responded with a polite, "Exception noted, Your Honor," and continued her methodical dismantling of the case against Andra. Her knowledge of precedent was so thorough that even when the judge ruled against her, she was building a strong record for potential appeal. By the end of the day, something remarkable had happened. The mighty Judge Harmon, known for controlling his courtroom with an iron fist, was being outmaneuvered at every turn by an elderly woman he had mocked just 2 days earlier. And everyone in the courtroom could see it. News travels fast in small places. By the next morning, the story of Dorothy Williams had spread beyond the courthouse walls. A local reporter named Elaine Chen had been in court for an unrelated case when she witnessed Dorothy's cross-examination. Intrigued, she spent the evening researching the mysterious elderly attorney who had emerged from nowhere. What she discovered made her cancel her other assignments. The front page of the morning newspaper featured a headline that caused Judge Harmon to spill his coffee: "Hidden Legal Giant, The Remarkable Career of Dorothy Williams." Beside it was a black and white photo from 1981 showing a younger Dorothy on the steps of the Supreme Court, legal briefs in hand. Dorothy hadn't seen the article. She was too busy preparing for court, spreading papers across her kitchen table while drinking tea from a chipped mug. Her phone rang constantly, but she let it go to voicemail. Focus was what mattered now. When she arrived at the courthouse, Dorothy noticed people looking at her differently. The security guards nodded with respect. The clerk smiled warmly. Even opposing attorneys gave her space in the hallway, some whispering to colleagues as she passed. "Professor Williams," called a voice behind her. Dorothy turned to see a group of young people approaching, law students from the local university, she realized. There were 7 of them, diverse in every way but united by the awe in their eyes. "We read about you this morning," said a young woman at the front of the group. "Our professor canceled class and told us to come watch you instead. Said we'd learn more in your courtroom than in his lecture." Dorothy felt her cheeks warm. "That's very kind, but I'm just doing my job." "Is it true you worked with Thurgood Marshall?" asked another student. "And that you helped draft the arguments for Reynolds v. State?" asked a third. Dorothy smiled gently. "Yes to both, but that was a long time ago." "Why haven't we heard of you before?" asked the first student. "We've studied all the major civil rights attorneys, but your name?" She trailed off, not wanting to be rude. An older man walking by overheard the question. He was a courthouse regular, a veteran attorney with gray hair and a weathered face. "Because history books are written by the winners," he said, stopping beside them. "And some people try to make sure certain names get smaller print than others." He extended his hand to Dorothy. "Jim Peterson. We opposed each other in the Bennett case, 1992. You wiped the floor with me." Dorothy's eyes lit with recognition. "Jim. I remember. That was a tough case." "For me it was," he laughed. "Listen, these kids should know. This woman changed the interpretation of the Fourth Amendment with her arguments in Williams v. Davis. That case is why police need warrants for certain searches now. You all probably studied it without knowing she was the architect." The students looked at Dorothy with even more wonder. One pulled out a notebook, asking if she would share advice for young lawyers. Another wanted to know about her experience as one of the first black women to argue before the Supreme Court. Dorothy answered kindly but briefly. "I have to prepare for court, but perhaps another time." Inside the courtroom, the gallery was already packed. News cameras weren't allowed, but sketch artists sat ready. Dorothy noticed Judge Harmon watching her from his chamber's doorway, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he quickly disappeared back inside. Thomas was waiting at the defense table, newspaper in hand. "Did you see this?" he asked, his voice excited. "No time for that now," Dorothy replied, setting down her briefcase. "How's Andra holding up?" "Better. I visited him last night and told him what you've been doing." He couldn't believe it. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Harmon entered. His usual swagger was noticeably subdued. "Before we continue," he began, "the court would like to acknowledge Professor Williams' distinguished career. Your contributions to the legal profession are significant." The words seemed forced, but Dorothy nodded graciously. "Thank you, Your Honor." The prosecutor looked uneasy as she called her next witness, the lead detective who had built the case against Andra. She rushed through her questions, clearly wanting to limit Dorothy's cross-examination opportunities. But Dorothy had been cross-examining officers for longer than this detective had been alive. When her turn came, she approached with the same unhurried pace as before. "Detective Thompson," she began, "you testified that the fingerprints found at the scene matched my client's. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am. We found a partial print on the window frame." "And when did you collect my client's prints for comparison?" "When he was brought in for questioning." Dorothy nodded thoughtfully. "Detective, are you aware that my client worked part-time at Taylor's Electronics last summer? Stocking shelves, helping customers?" The detective blinked. "No, I wasn't aware of that." "So you didn't know that he would have legitimately touched many surfaces in that store during his employment?" "The file didn't mention." "Just yes or no, please," Dorothy said gently. "No, I didn't know that." Dorothy continued her questioning, methodically revealing gaps in the investigation. No one had interviewed Andrew's former co-workers. No one had checked his employment records. The detective had built a case based on assumptions rather than facts. As Dorothy returned to her seat, she noticed something unusual. Judge Harmon was taking detailed notes, not just on the testimony, but on her questioning technique. Despite his initial dismissal and continued resistance, he was learning from her. During the lunch break, reporters swarmed the hallway. Dorothy declined all interviews, but Thomas, excited by their progress, spoke briefly to the press. "Professor Williams isn't just defending one client," he told them. "She's showing us all how justice should work." Dorothy overheard and gently pulled him away. "Be careful with the press, young man. The case isn't over yet." "But we're winning," he whispered. Dorothy shook her head. "We're doing our job. Justice isn't about winning or losing, it's about truth, and we still have more truth to uncover." As she turned to go back into the courtroom, Dorothy came face to face with Judge Harmon, who had exited through a side door. For a moment, they stood looking at each other, the judge who had mocked her, and the legal giant he had failed to recognize. "Professor Williams," he said quietly, "my chambers, please. There's something we need to discuss." Judge Harmon's chambers were exactly what Dorothy expected: dark wood paneling, law books perfectly arranged on shelves, and framed credentials covering the walls, everything designed to impress and intimidate. The judge closed the door behind them and gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Thank you for joining me, Professor Williams," he said, his tone formal but strained. He remained standing, pacing slightly before stopping to look out his window. "I wanted to speak with you privately." Dorothy waited, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She had been in enough judges' chambers over her long career to know that silence often revealed more than words. "I've been on this bench for 15 years, Harmon finally said. "Before that, I was a prosecutor for 12. I've handled thousands of cases. I know what I'm doing." "I'm sure you do, Your Honor," Dorothy replied evenly. He turned to face her. "Then why are you making me look like a fool in my own courtroom?" The question hung in the air between them. Dorothy could have answered it in many ways. She could have been angry about his mockery, defensive about her tactics, or apologetic to smooth things over. Instead, she chose honesty. "I'm not trying to embarrass you, Judge Harmon. I'm trying to defend my client. A young man who deserves a fair trial based on facts, not assumptions." She held his gaze steadily. "That's all any of us should want." "This case was straightforward before you showed up," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "The kind I've seen 100 times. And that's exactly the problem, Dorothy said, her voice still gentle but her words firm. When cases become the kind you've seen 100 times, people stop being individuals. They become types. And justice becomes an assembly line. The judge's face flushed. Are you accusing me of not doing my job properly? I'm suggesting that all of us, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, can fall into patterns. We see what we expect to see. Dorothy leaned forward slightly. When you looked at me 3 days ago, what did you see, Judge Harmon? An elderly woman who didn't belong in your courtroom. Someone to dismiss with a joke. The judge didn't answer, but his expression told her she hit the mark. And when you look at Andra, she continued, do you see a young man with no prior record? A student who works part-time to help his grandmother pay rent? Or do you just see another case number? Harmon sat down heavily in his chair. You've made your point. I didn't come to your chambers to make points, Dorothy said. I came because you asked me to, and because, despite our differences, we both took an oath to uphold the law. The judge was silent for a long moment. The prosecution has a new piece of evidence they want to introduce this afternoon. Security footage from a gas station 2 blocks from the electronics store. They claim it shows your client near the scene around the time of the break-in. Dorothy's eyes narrowed slightly. And you're telling me this because they should have disclosed it during discovery, because it's the right thing to do. He hesitated. And because I want to see how you handle it. Dorothy understood then. This wasn't just about Andrew's case anymore. Judge Harmon was testing her, perhaps testing himself too. Thank you for the information, she said, rising from her chair. I'll be ready. When court reconvened, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone could sense something had changed, though no one knew about the private conversation in the judge's chambers. As expected, the prosecutor stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, the state has recently obtained new evidence we wish to present, security footage from the Quick Stop gas station showing the defendant in the vicinity just minutes before the break-in. Thomas looked alarmed, but Dorothy placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Your Honor, Dorothy said, rising slowly to her feet, the defense objects to this evidence on multiple grounds. First, this footage was not disclosed during discovery as required by law. Second, its sudden appearance after 3 days of trial raises serious questions about the prosecution's methods. The prosecutor jumped in. We only just obtained this footage, Your Honor. The gas station owner came forward after reading about the case in this morning's paper. Judge Harmon looked at both attorneys, then at the folder containing the new evidence. Everyone in the courtroom watched, wondering how he would rule. Before I make my decision, he said slowly, I want to review this footage in my chambers, with both counsel present. This was unusual, and murmurs spread through the courtroom. The 3 attorneys followed the judge to his chambers, where he played the grainy security video on his computer. It showed a young man walking past the gas station at 11:37 p.m. The figure was of similar build to Andra, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. As you can see, the prosecutor said triumphantly, this places the defendant near the scene just before the crime. Dorothy studied the footage carefully, then asked, May I see it again, please? And could we slow it down when the person passes under the street light? The judge replayed the video, slowing it at the point Dorothy requested. She leaned closer to the screen. Your Honor, she said quietly, look at the person's walk. Andra has a slight limp from a childhood injury. This person doesn't limp at all. The judge watched again. She was right. There was no limp. Furthermore, Dorothy continued, the height is wrong. Using the gas pump as reference, this person is at least 3 inches taller than my client. The prosecutor's face fell as the judge studied the footage more carefully. This isn't just a matter of unclear evidence, Dorothy said, her voice taking on an edge they hadn't heard before. This is the prosecution grasping at straws, bringing in last-minute evidence that doesn't even match the defendant's basic physical characteristics. It suggests a troubling pattern of trying to make facts fit their theory, rather than following where the evidence leads. Judge Harmon turned off the video and sat quietly for a moment. Then he looked directly at the prosecutor. This evidence is inadmissible, he said firmly, and I want to see both of you in my courtroom immediately. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harmon addressed the gallery with unexpected sternness. The court has reviewed the prosecution's new evidence and found it to be inadmissible. Furthermore, he continued, his voice growing stronger, I have serious concerns about the handling of this entire case. The prosecution has repeatedly attempted to introduce flawed evidence while withholding potentially exculpatory information. Dorothy watched the judge with growing respect. He was doing something rare, acknowledging a mistake and correcting course, publicly and definitively. In light of these concerns, Judge Harmon concluded, I am inclined to grant the defense's motion to dismiss all charges. Does the prosecution wish to be heard before I rule? The prosecutor, stunned by this turn of events, could only shake her head. Very well, case dismissed. The defendant is to be released immediately. The judge's gavel came down with finality. The courtroom erupted in surprised exclamations. Andra, hardly believing what he heard, turned to Dorothy with tears in his eyes. Thomas was openly celebrating, shaking hands with everyone nearby. As Judge Harmon rose to leave, his eyes met Dorothy's across the courtroom. Between them passed a look of mutual respect, two legal professionals who had started as adversaries but ended with something close to understanding. Dorothy had won more than just Andrew's case. She had reminded everyone in that courtroom, including the judge, of a fundamental truth. Justice isn't about winning or losing, it's about getting it right. The courthouse steps were crowded with people when Dorothy emerged into the afternoon sunlight. News of the case dismissal had spread quickly, and reporters clustered at the bottom of the stairs, notebooks and microphones ready. Behind them stood law students, court employees, and curious onlookers, all eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had become an overnight sensation. Andrew walked beside her, finally free after weeks in custody. His grandmother waited at the bottom of the steps, tears streaming down her face. When she saw her grandson, she rushed forward, enveloping him in a tight embrace that said more than words ever could. Thank you, she whispered to Dorothy over Andrew's shoulder. Thank you for believing in him. Dorothy smiled warmly. He's a good young man. Make sure he doesn't miss any more classes. Thomas followed behind, carrying Dorothy's briefcase despite her protests. The young lawyer had changed over the past few days, his posture straighter, his eyes more focused, as if he'd remembered why he became an attorney in the first place. Professor Williams, called a reporter, pushing forward. How does it feel to return to the courtroom after 20 years and win such a high-profile case? Dorothy raised a hand to quiet the crowd. First, this isn't about me. It's about a young man who deserved fair treatment under the law and finally received it. Second, she added with a small smile, I didn't come out of retirement to become a celebrity. I came because I was needed. Will you take on more cases now? Someone else shouted. Are you going to sue Judge Harmon for discrimination? Called another. Dorothy shook her head at the questions. What I'm going to do right now is go home and put my feet up. These old bones aren't used to courtroom hours anymore. The crowd laughed, but their eyes still held admiration and curiosity. A young woman pushed forward, one of the law students who had watched the trial. Professor Williams, she said, her voice trembling slightly, would you consider teaching again? Even just a guest lecture? There's so much we could learn from you. Before Dorothy could answer, a deep voice spoke from behind her. I'd like to second that request. The crowd parted as Judge Harmon descended the courthouse steps. He looked different somehow, the arrogance gone from his bearing, replaced by something close to humility. Professor Williams, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I owe you an apology. Not just for my behavior in the courtroom, but for something more fundamental. I failed to see you, truly see you, when you stood before me. I made assumptions based on appearance, and in doing so, I betrayed my oath as a judge. A hush fell over the crowd. No one had expected this public admission from the notoriously proud judge. Dorothy studied him for a moment, then extended her hand. Apology accepted, Judge Harmon. He shook her hand, relief evident on his face. I've spoken with the dean of the law school. They would be honored if you would consider teaching a seminar on trial advocacy. The students could benefit enormously from your experience. And some of the judges too, perhaps? Dorothy asked with a twinkle in her eye. Judge Harmon actually smiled. Especially the judges. As the crowd reacted to this exchange, Dorothy noticed a small figure at the edge of the gathering. An elderly black man leaned on a cane, watching her with unmistakable pride. She hadn't seen her old colleague George Washington in years, but he had clearly come when he heard she was back in court. "You still got it, Dot," he called out, using the nickname only her closest friends knew. "You still got it." Dorothy felt a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe she did still have it. And maybe that meant something. Later that evening, Dorothy sat on her small apartment balcony, watching the sunset with a cup of tea. The phone inside had finally stopped ringing after she'd unplugged it. Tomorrow's newspaper sat on the table, her picture on the front page above the headline, "Justice Served. How One Woman Changed a Courtroom." Thomas had dropped by earlier with a gift, a new leather briefcase with her initials embossed on the side. "For your next case," he'd said with a grin. The young man had already asked if he could come work with her, learn from her. She hadn't given him an answer yet. The law school dean had called too, formally offering her a position teaching trial advocacy 1 day a week. "Our students need to learn from someone who doesn't just know the law, but understands justice," he'd said. Dorothy sipped her tea, considering these new possibilities. When she'd stepped into that courtroom days ago, she had only wanted to help one young man. She never expected to find herself pulled back into the legal world she'd left behind. Her late husband's picture sat on the small table beside her. "What do you think, Harold?" she asked softly. "Should I dust off the old law books for good?" A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the potted plant beside her. Dorothy smiled, choosing to take it as a sign. Life had seasons, as she told Thomas. Her season of quiet retirement had been peaceful, but perhaps it wasn't her final season after all. Perhaps there was still work to be done, students to teach, and justice to pursue. Dorothy Williams had spent decades fighting for people who needed a voice. She had broken barriers and changed laws. Then she had stepped away, thinking her time had passed. But as the sun set on this remarkable week, she realized that wisdom, experience, and courage never truly went out of season. Sometimes they just needed a reminder, a reason to shine again. She thought of Andra, now back with his family. She thought of Thomas, with his renewed passion for justice. She thought of Judge Harmon, facing his own biases for perhaps the first time. And she thought of the young law students, watching her with hope in their eyes. "Well, Harold," she said to her husband's picture, "it seems I'm not quite finished yet." Dorothy picked up a legal pad and began to write the outline for her first lecture. Its title, printed at the top of the page in her neat handwriting, read simply, "Beyond Appearances. The True Nature of Justice." Outside her window, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Like Dorothy herself, they had been there all along, sometimes hidden, sometimes overlooked, but always shining, waiting for the right moment to light the way forward.